You're watching Tag TV. I'm your host, Tahir Gora, in my show, Candid Talk. Today, I'm joined with a very special guest, Mr. Kamran Bokhari. Welcome, Mr. Kamran Bokhari.
Thank you for having me, Tahir.
Kamran, as everyone knows, you are senior countering violent extremist expert affiliated with University of Ottawa. And today we are talking about this horrific act, what happened yesterday in France, Paris. So how would you reflect on it?
Well, I mean, first of all, from a purely analytical point of view, I'm not surprised that this is happening. And particularly in France, where the social and demographic situation is as such that there is a lot of room for groups like ISIS and Qaeda to move around, to recruit people. There's a lot of resentment within local Muslim communities where these groups can find recruits very easily. And plus, the sheer number of problems that European countries are involved with, in particular the refugee crisis, it sort of constrains the ability of the government to prevent such attacks from happening. I mean, it's horrific, but unfortunately, which is the bad news, is that this is not going to be the last attack. I mean, there will be other attacks, given what we know about the situation, given what we know about ISIS capabilities, and its ability to exploit weaknesses and openings within our systems here in the West.
You're very blunt in terms of expressing your views, and I really appreciate that. But how would we call these acts, like acts of terrorism, and how would we name them?
Yes, clearly they're acts of urban terrorism. There is no other word for it. It's very clear, very blatant, very vile. But I would also say that the entity, the machine that's producing these attacks should not be treated as your run-of-the-mill terrorist organization. That's our problem, is that we have not really gone beyond the Al-Qaeda paradigm. We need to look at this in a much more sophisticated way. This is an entity, I'm talking about Daesh, which is holding territory in Iraq and Syria, and yet able to produce transcontinental attacks. And these are pretty sophisticated attacks. I'm not sure if the downing of the Russian plane in the Sinai in Sharm el-Sheikh is the doing of ISIS. The jury's still out on that. But if it turns out that they were responsible for that, then we're looking at a very, very sophisticated institutional capability. And therefore, while it is a terrorist attack, the machinery that's behind it is not just your run-of-the-mill terrorist organization or even a guerrilla movement or an insurgent movement. People have called it a proto-state. I would say that the ability to hold territory in Syria and Iraq suggests that we're looking at conventional army capabilities, conventional military multi-divisional capabilities. And the ability to pull off transcontinental attacks suggests that we're looking at a group that has some very sophisticated intelligence capabilities. So yes, it's a terrorist attack, but if we're going to defeat these people, we have to become sophisticated in how we understand them.
You said it's a terrorist attack. For sure it is a terrorist attack. But the reason I pose this question, because I see in a different way as well, like ISIS is behaving like an independent state. And it seems like that independent state, which is of course not recognized by any world leader, but that state is interfering the life of other states. So isn't something that the world need to counter this state?
Yes, that is the big question, that how do we neutralize the threat that ISIS poses? It's no secret that unless you uproot it from Syria and Iraq, more specifically Syria, we're not going to be able to degrade its capabilities. What is needed in Syria and Iraq? But let's focus on Syria for a moment. Are boots on the ground. So we know that there are limits to how far air power alone And if you supplement that with special operations forces and intelligence operations, there are limits to how far we'll see success in trying to uproot and degrade ISIS. What we really need are boots on the ground. Now the problem is who's going to provide those boots. The United States is already moving away from that boots on the ground doctrine. It has moved away actually. Its doctrine involves the regional players to take the lead. So if the United States is not committing forces, there is no appetite in Washington for anyone to commit forces, then if we're looking at regional forces, then let's look at the capabilities of the regional players. You look at the United States is relying on Turkey. And it's very logical because Turkey is the largest military force in the region. It is the most powerful economy in the region. It's like number 17 or 18 in terms of the world ranking with its economy. It has a long border and therefore an interest to dealing with the Syrian situation. But it has its own problems. It has its priorities. And it's not the only player in the region. Iran is involved there. Saudi Arabia, and then Qatar and UAE, and now we have Russia as well. And so when you have too many stakeholders trying to shape a geopolitical outcome in a very small geography called Syria, then you have the problem that we deal with now. And so Turkey is not willing to take the lead. Turkey knows that it doesn't want to look like Pakistan of the last few years, because it knows that once ISIS is degraded, after all is said and done, everybody goes home. They can't go home. They live there. They'll be dealing with this problem long after everybody else has, basically moved on to something else. Then they are more worried about the Kurds than they are worried about anything else to begin with, including ISIS. They want to topple the Assad regime, but then the Kurds are in the way, ISIS is in the way. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE don't have the forces to commit. And frankly speaking, if from their point of view, ISIS seems like a force multiplier against Iran and the Shia, and actually helps put the pressure and tighten the screws on the Assad regime. Russia is not interested in Syria primarily for the sake of Syria. Russia is interested in using Syria as a lever to gain concessions on Ukraine. And the Arab states are actually moving, focused on Yemen. Yemen is more important to them than Syria because it's in their backyard. Finally, you have Iran. Iran is also interested in supporting the Assad regime as opposed to dedicating itself to the fight against ISIS. And I would argue that there is an ISIS actually helps Iran because it allows Iran to align itself with U.S. The more there is an ISIS, the more Iranian and American interests converge, which is what the Iranians want. So in this context, there's really nobody confronting ISIS head on, and therefore it continues to exist and expand.
So nobody is confronting ISIS head on, as you are saying. So we have danger of ISIS everywhere in the world, as we have witnessed yesterday in France, and this is not the first time happened in France. And you are very much concerned about this sort of actions by ISIS in future as well. So in terms of Canada particularly, as our new Prime Minister has pledged to withdraw forces, whatever we had there, not much though, from that region, is it the wise decision, you think?
Well, I mean, if we don't have too many to begin with, then the question is, does it make a difference? I don't think it makes much of a difference. Symbolically, it does, that, Canada is withdrawing. It emboldens ISIS, saying that, look, nobody wants to fight with us. So yes, there is a negative, but in sheer military numbers and capability, I don't think we're making much of a difference. It's a little bit into the pool of global resources against ISIS. What we really need to do is really reevaluate where we're going as a country. I've long been arguing, and you've heard me say this on your shows before, that we need a dedicated foreign intelligence service.
Like Canadian.
Yeah, a Canadian dedicated foreign intelligence service. CSIS has too much on its plate. Either let CSIS become that dedicated foreign intelligence service and create a new domestic one, or however you do the division of labor, but we need a dedicated. Why? We're a country of immigrants. We don't deal, I mean, we have this refugee problem right now because of Syria, but we're also constantly getting immigrants, most of whom are law-abiding people looking for a better life for their kids. But as part of that wave, and as the world becomes more unstable, then we need to be able to tell the good guys from the bad guys. How are we going to do that? For now, we're relying on our relationship with the United States. The United States, as we know, is already having its plate full. We're part of the Five Eyes with Alliance, Intelligence Sharing Alliance, the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But there are limits to what we can derive from that. We need to be able to fend for ourselves. Our military force, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70, 80,000 personnel tops, is too small for our size. We need a bigger military. And I'm not saying we're going to go to war for that, but militaries provide other functions as well. If we're going to do our signature development, reconstruction, humanitarian work that we do, we still need forces. So we really need to take a hard look. The Prime Minister needs to take a hard look at the world and really not look at politics for a moment and say, okay, what is the objective geopolitical reality that is staring me in the face? And how can I protect Canada? And it will be very clear to him that he needs to be able to, have a massive overhaul of our strategic outlook. Once you overhaul and you realign yourself in terms of an outlook, in terms of a paradigm, then all the other things fall in place. But we really need to first reevaluate and have this debate inside Canada. Our problem is that most of the public discourse is where it was 20 years ago, when the world was a very different place. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, everybody was celebrating the death of communism and the implosion of the Soviet Union and thought that, the end of history had arrived, to borrow from Francis Fukuyama, and that the world will become a much better place. But that doesn't really happen. If you look and read history, the world has never been a peaceful place. There's a real world out there that we need to understand and then operate from there.
Right. In terms of refugee, as we are importing 25,000 refugees from Syria, as Prime Minister has promised, in next 2 months, do you have any concern in terms of their scrutiny, in terms of their checkout, whatever?
I think our people do a good job, but does that mean we can fully protect ourselves? No. That's why I'm saying that we need a dedicated foreign intelligence service that will help us. There'll be our eyes out there in the world, looking at things and alerting the government to potential problems, and then the government can formulate policy responses for that. It's not, and again, it's not just a matter of 25,000 refugees. We're a country of immigrants. Immigration constantly continues. We have to have a mechanism in place where we have people coming over to this country who don't, we're worried about people engaging in violence, which is important, very important. But we also need to understand that it's not just about violent people. We also need to understand that immigration should not lead to an erosion of what we hold and dear in this country, Canadian values. And they could be as simple as rule of the law, and democracy, freedoms. We need to have an immigration system that not just has people coming over from different countries and living here, but also integrating them into Canadian mainstream life. Of course, we have a multicultural ethos, and that's great. We should continue to have that, but it should be balanced where everybody has their particular culture that emanates from their origin, national origin, background, but they also should find themselves, integrated into something called Canadian mainstream life. And that's another big challenge, which we're not really discussing at the level that it should be discussed. So
in this whole scenario, I would like to, know your take on what should Canada do to protect our borders from such happenings, what we have seen in France.
I think that we're, our border security agency is doing a pretty good job. It just needs to continue doing it, and of course there's a lot of room for improvement. But really, the eyes and of any state or its intelligence services. They're the sort of the people who are the first detectors, if you will. We talk about first responders, as in firemen, ambulances, and police. Let's talk about first detectors, people who are able to detect a potential problem. It may not turn out to be not a problem, but how do we determine that unless we go through the process? So we need to have good first detectors, which should be our intelligence service. I don't think they're there at that level. If we have a good sense, increase our cooperation with our allies, not just Five Eyes allies, but also regional players, and have relationships. And one of the problems with our former government was that at a time when the United States was secretly negotiating with the Ahmadinejad government to cut a nuclear deal, which manifested under current President Hassan Rouhani. It took a while, but it was negotiating. We were going in the opposite direction. We cut ties with Iran. I mean, those are sort of strategic blunders as I look at them by any government. We can't afford to take sides. We have to take reality as it is. We wish that everybody would be like a secular, democracy-loving people, but that's not how the world is. The world out there is a dangerous place. So what we want and what we can have are two separate things. Let's focus on what we can actually have, and then maybe we can get to what we want. But it's not the other way around. We can't live in as if this was 25 years ago. We have to step up. Our foreign affairs ministry should become far more effective. Our defense ministry should be overhauled. The intelligence services. The way we immigrate people. There's a lot of work out there to be done.
You're saying that all these important ministries should be better functioning, but the issue is, how do you see the new cabinet and how do you see things going on?
While the Prime Minister is to be praised for coming up with a cabinet that reflects demography, gender demography. I mean, that's a great thing. I support it. I'm all for it. But I do have concerns about experience. I do have concerns about these are very important portfolios, and the question is, and I don't want to sort of prejudge anybody. It's just very new. It may turn out that many of these people who are appointed turn out to be fantastic ministers, and they run their ministries with efficiency, and hopefully take them to newer heights. But I also have to be realistic. I can. That is something I want. Can I have that as a citizen? And therefore, I have concerns about experience, and hopefully, I only hope that I'm proven wrong. And so, I would want to reserve judgment. I'm expressing concerns, but I want to reserve judgment until I've seen performance.
In the end, I like to ask: do you see any concern in terms of violent people here in Canada that that may carry acts like that, what we have seen in Paris?
I'm always afraid, but I'm also careful to say that. So there are two things that are necessary for attacks like what happened, the horrible attack in Paris last night. Number one is intent. And yes, there are lots of people, you and I have discussed it, over and over, of different quarters of people with intent who have the wrong ideas. But having intent and the wrong ideas, while it's necessary, is not sufficient. You need capability. And capability, there's no substitute for capability. The people who pulled off yesterday's attacks were highly skilled, unfortunately. I'm saddened to say that, but that's the reality of what we're dealing with. These are people who are highly motivated, well trained in the tradecraft of terrorism. And we need to be able to sort of distinguish between extremists and terrorists. Now, obviously, we also need to be mindful of how many people are graduating from the pool of extremism towards terrorism. And that's a difficult thing to do. So yes, there are people who are potentially problematic. The question is that what are we going to do about them in order to prevent them from A, not gaining the capability, B, countering violent extremism. How do you counter people who are extremists? And then there is the question of, well, how do we distinguish between bona fide extremists who could become a potential threat to the country and just your good old-fashioned conservative people who have conservative views? We may not agree with them, but they're not really engaging in any type of activity that's breaking the law. And that's a very tricky thing to do. If we're not careful, we may worsen the problem. We may push people into the arms of groups like ISIS if we somehow confuse extremists with ultra-conservatives.
But I hate to ask last question, since I've said that my last question, but don't you think that those ultra-conservative Islamists are the breeding ground for those kind of terrorists?
Yes, they are. And that is the conundrum that we face. So it's like you can't jump to a conclusion that these guys are extremists and terrorists, but at the same time you can't ignore them either, because it's from within these contexts that people actually graduate towards more radical impulses. There is no straight line from being ultra conservative to becoming a terrorist. This is a very, very complex process. It's not linear. A lot of people don't end up becoming terrorists, but yes, it is a potential space in which extremists and terrorists can breed. At least it's a context in which it's kind of like the water in which the fish swim. So how do we do that is a huge challenge. I don't think anybody has the answer to that. I think we need to work hard on it. And that's why I think the challenge in front of the government, in front of civil society, in front of people who are experts, whether they're in academia or journalism or in the think tank community, although we don't have much of a think tank community in this country, which is another problem. But it's our collective, challenge, and we have to come up with ways in which we can deal with this.
Thank you very much, Kamran.
My pleasure.
Thank you, viewers watching for our show.